The blade was already at Marina Wren's throat when Astarion Moroi walked through the door. She had not screamed. That was the first thing he noticed. Most humans screamed. They wept, they begged, they crumbled like wet paper under the weight of supernatural terror. But Marina Wren stood with her chin lifted and her dark eyes burning, her paint-stained hands held carefully away from her body, and she watched the vampire prince cross the threshold of her studio with the calm, measuring gaze of someone cataloguing a composition rather than awaiting execution. The vampire holding the blade was named Veloris, and he was old enough to have attended the original coronation of the Moroi bloodline 3 centuries prior. He was also, Astarion noted with the cold clarity that came from 700 years of political survival, completely out of his mind with desperation. "Step back, Prince," Veloris said. His voice was silk stretched over a razor. "She is leverage, nothing more. You will withdraw the blood decree, or I will make the remainder of her very short life considerably less comfortable than she deserves." Astarion did not step back. He stepped forward, slowly, with the kind of deliberate grace that communicated absolute certainty about how this evening was going to end. His silver hair caught the light from Marina's work lamps, the same lamps she used to paint by, the ones she had told him once produced the closest approximation of honest light she had ever found. He had remembered that detail. He remembered every detail she had ever shared with him, though he had never told her so. "You have made," Astarion said, each word precise as a cut diamond, "a catastrophic error in your understanding of the situation. Veloris, I understand the situation perfectly. The council will revoke the decree if you ask them. You are the last of the Moroi line. Your word carries the full weight of... My word carries the full weight of a man who will remove your head from your shoulders before you finish that sentence if you do not release her immediately." It was not a threat. Astarion Moroi did not traffic in threats. Everything he said was a statement of fact, and every person in that room understood the difference. Veloris understood it too, but desperation had stripped him of wisdom. The blade pressed closer. Marina drew one slow breath, and her eyes moved to Astarion's face, not in panic, but in the clear, direct way she had of looking at things she intended to understand. "I am fine," she said quietly. To him, not to Veloris, not to the room, to him specifically. As though the only thing that mattered in this moment was making certain he knew she had not broken. Something inside Astarion's chest, in the hollow space where a human heart would have hammered, went entirely, devastatingly still. He moved. The speed at which a 7-century-old vampire prince moved was not something the human eye could track. It was a shift in the quality of the air, a displacement of shadow, and then Veloris was pressed against the far wall with Astarion's hand at his throat and the blade on the floor, and Marina was stepping calmly to the side, away from the confrontation, retrieving her paintbrush from the table as if this were an interruption she planned to return from shortly. "The decree stands," Astarion said, very quietly, "and you will go before the council tomorrow and confess the full measure of this foolishness. If you do not, I will remember this night for the next several centuries, and I have an extraordinarily long memory." He released Veloris. The older vampire straightened his jacket, looked once at Marina with something approaching surprise and shame, and then he was gone through the window he had presumably entered by, leaving nothing behind but the ghost of displaced air and the lingering, cold smell of old blood that always clung to the truly ancient ones. Silence settled over the studio. Marina looked down at the paintbrush in her hand, then up at Astarion, who had not moved from his position near the wall. He was watching her with the expression she had spent weeks trying to capture in paint and had never quite managed. That look of absolute composure wrapped over something that churned with enormous, barely contained depth. "Well," Marina said, "I suppose you are going to tell me this is why you have been following me." The thing was, she was not wrong. He had been following her for 6 weeks. Not with malice, and not even, at first, with any clear intention beyond the baffling compulsion she had produced in him from the moment he had first seen her work. It had begun at a gallery opening in the converted industrial district, 3 miles from the Moroi court's hidden seat beneath the city. Astarion had attended for political reasons, as a concession to one of the court's human world liaisons who had been pressing for increased vampire visibility in cultural events. He had expected to tolerate it for an hour and leave. Instead, he had stood in front of one of Marina Wren's paintings for 45 minutes and failed entirely to move on. The painting was enormous, 6 feet across, and it depicted the moment just before dawn, from a perspective that could only have been imagined rather than witnessed, because what Marina had captured was not the sunrise itself, but the texture of the darkness that preceded it, the way the night held its breath, the quality of anticipation that existed in the air when something ancient and irreversible was about to change. She had painted it in layers of deep indigo and ash grey and the particular shade of violet that existed only in that precise threshold moment, and she had painted it with such technical mastery and such raw emotional intelligence that Astarion had stood in front of it and felt, for the first time in longer than he could reasonably calculate, something that functioned like recognition. She had painted what it felt like to be him. He had not sought her out that night. He had purchased the painting through an intermediary, brought it back to the court, and hung it in the private chamber he had occupied for 3 centuries. He had stood before it in the dark, which was the only way he ever looked at anything he truly valued, and tried to understand why a 26-year-old human woman had managed to articulate something he had spent 700 years unable to put into words, even to himself. He had gone back to the gallery the following week, and the week after that. He had found her studio eventually, not through any supernatural surveillance, but through the entirely mundane process of following the logical chain of information available in the world of art. Her website, her social media presence, the studio address listed in the corner of her professional biography. He had stood on the pavement outside her building on 4 separate nights, examining the rectangle of warm light visible through her 3rd-floor windows, and told himself each time that he was not going to knock on the door. Then Vealoris had used her as leverage in the decree dispute, and the question of knocking became irrelevant. Marina Wren, it turned out, had also known he was there. "You are remarkably visible for a supernatural predator," she said now, lowering herself onto the paint-spattered stool she kept near her drafting table. Pale man standing under the streetlight for 3 hours at a stretch. "I started to think you were either a vampire or the world's most patient stalker. I was concerned for your safety," Astarion said, which was true, though incomplete. "Were you?" It was. Not a question. She had a way of making statements that stripped pretension from conversations with surgical precision. "Sit down. You can tell me why someone who looks like he runs a small country decided my studio needed a personal guardian." Astarion looked at the only other seat in the room, a battered wooden chair wedged between a shelf of oil paints and a stack of stretched canvases. He sat in it with the kind of dignity that made even paint-spattered wooden chairs seem like thrones. "My name is Astarion Moroi," he said. "I am the prince of the Moroi bloodline, and the last of my family line. The man who had a blade at your throat was a member of the vampire court over which I preside, and he chose you as leverage in a political dispute because he believed your connection to me would give him negotiating power." Marina absorbed this. Her expression did not change exactly, but something shifted behind her eyes. Intelligent recalibration. "He believed my connection to you," she repeated. "What connection did he believe we had?" "He believed I had developed a personal interest in your well-being, had you?" The honest answer was yes, in a way that went considerably beyond anything Astarion could easily articulate or safely admit. What he said was, "Your safety became my responsibility the moment he made you a target in my court's political landscape." Marina picked up her paintbrush again, not to paint, but to turn it slowly between her fingers the way he had noticed she did when she was thinking. It was one of the details he had catalogued. He had catalogued a great many details about Marina Wren from the distance of those pavement vigils, more than was entirely reasonable. "You bought my painting," she said. "The big one, from the Callaway Gallery." He said nothing. I recognized the name on the purchase receipt. "Moroi. It is not a common name. I thought it might be a coincidence." She looked up at him. "It was not a coincidence, no. Which painting did you buy?" "The one you titled Threshold." Something moved across Marina's face then. Surprise, genuine and unguarded, which made it different from her usual composed responses in a way that made the room feel suddenly warmer. "That is the one I painted after my mother died," she said quietly. "I was trying to paint what I thought she might have seen the moment just before. The not quite darkness and the not quite light." She paused. "Most people find it unsettling. I found it accurate." The room was quiet for a long moment. "How old are you?" Marina asked. 732 years. She did not flinch. He had expected at least a pause, a recalibration, the involuntary recoil that even the most intellectually prepared humans experienced when the abstract reality of immortality landed with its full weight. Marina simply nodded, as if he had told her something she had half suspected. "Then you have actually seen the threshold moment," she said. "Many times. From the other side of it." "Yes. Is the painting accurate?" Astarion looked at her steadily. "It is the most accurate thing I have seen in 3 centuries. Marina was quiet again. Then she stood, walked to a large canvas propped against the far wall with its face hidden, and turned it around. It was him, not literally, not a portrait, but it was unmistakably him in every essential quality. A figure rendered in silver and deep shadow, standing at the edge of something vast, with a posture that conveyed absolute power and absolute solitude in equal measure. The figure's face was turned slightly away, not in hiding but in the particular way of something ancient that had grown accustomed to watching rather than being watched. She had painted it in layers, the way she did everything, and the layers communicated something that a single pass of the brush never could have, a complexity of feeling that existed in the same moment, the grief and the pride and the strange, unasked-for hunger for something that had been believed impossible to want. "I started it 3 weeks ago," Marina said. "I did not know who I was painting. I just kept seeing him." Astarion stood and crossed the room to stand before the canvas. He looked at it the way he had looked at Threshold, with the full attention of someone for whom time moved differently and who had learned to give rare things their full weight. "You should not have made this visible," he said. If the wrong members of my court saw it, they would know what Veloris already suspected. What did Veloris suspect? Astarion turned from the painting to look at her. She was close, closer than she had been for the previous part of the conversation, standing just at the edge of the space that existed between the professional and the personal. That you matter to me, he said, in a way that makes you dangerous to me and me dangerous to you. Marina looked at him for a long time. The paint-stained fingers of her right hand were loose around the brush handle. The work lamps threw warm light across one side of her face and left the other in shadow. You have been standing outside my building for 6 weeks, she said, watching my window. Yes, you could have knocked. I did not know what I would say. That is the first, genuinely surprising thing you have told me tonight, Marina said. I had the impression you always knew what to say, in court politics, in matters of bloodline law and ancient compact, and the negotiation of treaties between powers that have existed for millennia. In those contexts, I know what to say. He paused. I did not know what to say to you. Marina set down her paintbrush on the table with a quiet, deliberate click. You could start, she said, by telling me what actually lost everything means, because you said you are the last of your line, and threshold means something to you that it does not mean to most people, and someone used me as leverage tonight because they believed I mattered to you, which suggests you have not had very many people who mattered to you for a very long time. She paused. You can tell me what you lost. He should not have told her. That was the rational position, the politically sound position, the position consistent with every protocol of vampire court secrecy, and the ancient blood law that governed how much of their world could be disclosed to humans outs the formal compact. He had broken no compact yet. Marina Wren was not a sanctioned human liaison. She was a painter who had produced one extraordinary piece of art and inadvertently become the subject of a vampire prince's uncharacteristic fixation. He told her anyway. The Moroi bloodline had once comprised an entire dynasty, not a family in the human sense, not a unit of parents and children and cousins gathered at holiday tables, but a lineage of extraordinary vampires spanning 8 generations, bound by blood compact and the ancient vows of the founding house. They had maintained the court beneath the city for 400 years, governing the vampire population that existed within the city's shadow, enforcing the blood laws that kept both vampire and human populations safe from the worst possibilities of their intersection, mediating disputes, maintaining the ancient codes that had been established when the first Moroi ancestor had negotiated the first formal compact with the human world 7 centuries prior. They had been powerful and careful and proud. And then, 40 years ago, a faction within the court had decided that the careful balance the Moroi line maintained was an obstacle rather than a safeguard. The betrayal had not come suddenly. It had been constructed over decades, patient and architectural, the way the most devastating betrayals always were. Individual members of the bloodline had been targeted, discredited, removed from positions of influence through manufactured scandals, false accusations laid before the court's governing tribunal. The methods had been sophisticated, the evidence against each target convincing enough to fracture internal loyalty before the pattern became clear. By the time Astarion had understood what was happening, he was the only one left. His mother, Seravienne, had been the last before him. She had died not by violence, but by the ancient vampire mechanism of forced exile, cast beyond the blood compact's protection, with her assets stripped and her authority revoked. and when a vampire of her age and power lost the anchor of their bloodline and court, they declined. He had held her hand, if that was the right word for the exchange of warmth between two beings whose temperature ran considerably below human normal, and watched her diminish. She had told him, near the end, that the court was worth saving, that the blood laws mattered, that someone had to remain who understood what the laws were, for he had remained. He had spent 40 years rebuilding from the gutted frame of a dynasty, re-establishing authority by the slow process of political survival, identifying the members of the faction that had destroyed his family, and removing them through the same patient, architectural methodology they had used against his line. He had done it correctly, legally by the letter of every blood law and ancient code, because Seravienne had taught him that a Moroi did not abandon the codes, simply because someone else had, and because the codes existed to protect everyone in the compact, vampire and human both. He had accomplished almost everything. The faction was nearly dismantled. The court was nearly restored to what it had been. Vealoris and the blood decree dispute was the last significant obstacle, a final desperate maneuver by the last significant player in the faction that had destroyed his family. But 40 years of political warfare and isolation had cost him something that no legal victory could restore. He had become, without fully noticing it happening, a man who had forgotten what it felt like to want something for himself. He had not let himself want anything that could be taken and used as leverage. He had not let himself care about anything he could not afford to lose, until a painting of the threshold between darkness and light had stopped him cold in a gallery and refused to let him walk away. Marina listened to all of this without interrupting. She was very good at listening, he noticed. She gave people the full weight of her attention, which was a quality he had observed was rarer than it ought to be. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she stood and went to the kitchen area at the far end of the studio and put the kettle on. "Tea," she said, which was not a question. "I think better with tea, and I need to think for a moment." He watched her move around the small kitchen space with the economical, precise movements of someone who knew exactly where everything was and had no patience for wasted motion. She was wearing paint-stained jeans and a grey jumper with a small hole at the left cuff, and her dark hair was pulled back in the practical way she wore it when she was working. She was, by any objective measure, the most ordinary human person who had ever held his attention for more than the length of a conversation. She was also, he was beginning to understand, the least ordinary person he had encountered in 7 centuries. She brought him a mug of tea he had no physiological use for, and sat back down on her stool and wrapped her own mug in both hands and looked at him with those dark, direct eyes. "The blood decree Vealoris wants you to revoke," she said. "What is it?" "It is a protective measure I put before the court 8 months ago. It establishes formal legal consequences for any vampire who targets a human outside the sanctioned compact. Currently, the law has teeth in theory, but not in practice. The decree would create an enforcement mechanism. Vealoris opposes it because he wants to retain the ability to use humans as leveraged without consequence, among other reasons. No. And he chose me. And because he found out you had been standing under my window, his informant him I had developed an attachment. He assumed it was the usual kind, that you were someone I could be coerced through." Astarion paused. He was not entirely wrong in the essential assessment. He was wrong about what I would do in response to coercion. Marina turned her mug in her hands. What does the Blood Compact say about humans who become personally involved with members of the court? He looked at her carefully. You are asking a very precise question. I am a precise person. The compact has provisions for formal human liaisons, humans who are brought into acknowledged relationship with a vampire of the court and given corresponding protections. It is not common. It requires a formal petition before the tribunal, disclosure of the human's full identity, and the vampire's binding vow of responsibility for the human's safety. And if a vampire petitions for that status for a human who is already a target of a court faction, then that human becomes formally protected under the blood laws, Astarion said slowly, and any action taken against them becomes an action taken against the court itself, which would remove Vaeloris's leverage entirely. It would. But it would also bind you formally to my safety. Yes. Marina considered him over the rim of her mug. Are you about to ask me something? I am considering whether I have any right to ask you something that would restructure your entire relationship to a world you discovered existed approximately 45 minutes ago. I have known for longer than 45 minutes, Marina said. I have painted what you are for 3 weeks. I have been aware of something watching my window for 6 weeks. I researched vampire lore the way I research anything I need to understand in order to paint it accurately. The Moroi name appears in enough historical documents that a thorough researcher can reach some conclusions. She looked at him steadily. I am not as uninformed as you assumed. Astarion felt something shift, a recalibration of his own assumptions that was itself unfamiliar, because he was not accustomed to being the one who had underestimated. Then, you know, he said, what a formal petition would mean. It means you would be responsible for me. Formally, legally, before your court. Yes, and what would I be responsible for? He paused. The honest answer required more personal disclosure than he had offered anyone in 40 years, and the fact that it felt both dangerous and necessary was itself a kind of evidence. Nothing formal. The compact is asymmetrical in that respect. The human enters protection, the vampire enters obligation. Marina set down her mug. That is not acceptable to me, she said. Astarion frowned. The compact's terms are not negotiable. I did not say I wanted to renegotiate the compact. I said the asymmetry is not acceptable to me personally. If you are going to be responsible for my safety, I am going to be responsible for something in return, even if the law does not require it. She met his eyes. That is a condition of my agreeing. He looked at her for a long moment. 700 years had given him the ability to read people with considerable accuracy, to identify the quality of their intentions, to distinguish between the performance of strength and its genuine article. Marina Wren was not performing anything. She was simply, absolutely, irreducibly herself. What would you be responsible for? He asked quietly. She reached out and touched, very briefly, the edge of his hand where it rested on the table. Not a grip, not a claim, just a contact, brief and warm and precise, reminding you what remains, she said. They sat with that for a moment that had a quality of its own, separate from the ordinary procession of minutes. All right. Astarion said the petition before the Moroi court tribunal was filed the following evening. Astarion had composed it with the careful language of 7 centuries of legal tradition, and he had read it to Marina the night before the filing, standing in her studio while she made notes in the small sketchbook she always kept close, asking questions about the blood law terminology with the same focused attention she brought to understanding any complex subject. The tribunal was convened in the vault beneath the city, the original chamber of the Moroi court, carved from bedrock 4 centuries prior, when the first of his line had established the compact. It was lit by oil lamps whose flames did not entirely behave the way ordinary fire did, a characteristic of the old court magic that had never been fully explained even to its own practitioners. The walls were lined with the records of every petition, decree, and blood law that had passed through the court in 400 years, and the 3 tribunal members sat at the curved stone table that had been shaped from a single piece of marble, quarried from a mountainside that no longer existed. Valores was present, required by procedure to attend any tribunal convened during the period of an active dispute. He stood at the far end of the chamber with an expression that communicated the particular mixture of fury and defeat that came from watching an opponent outmaneuver a supposedly decisive play. Marina stood at Astarion's right side, which was the formal position of the petitioned human, and she was wearing a dark dress she had chosen deliberately because she told him, researched the court's aesthetic conventions and had no intention of arriving looking as though she had not taken the occasion seriously. She had her dark hair down, which she rarely did, and she had brought her small sketchbook, which she held against her side. The head of the tribunal was an ancient vampire named Thesivan, whose white hair was braided in the old style and whose eyes were amber, a very old amber, preserved something alive at its heart. She had presided over the Moroi court for longer than Astarion had existed, and she regarded him now with an expression he could not entirely read. "Prince Moroi," Thesivan said. Her voice was like the sound a cave made when you spoke into it. "You petition for formal liaison status for the human Marina Wren. I do. You offer the binding vow of protection. I do." Thesivan looked at Marina with the thorough attention of someone accustomed to evaluating whether a thing was what it appeared to be. Marina looked back at her with the same quality of attention, and Astarion watched the old vampire's expression shift, fractionally, towards something that might have been approval. "Human," Thesivan said, "you understand the nature of this compact." "I do," Marina said. Her voice was steady. "You enter it of your own will. I enter it of my own will, and with full understanding of its terms. There is a question that the tribunal is required to ask, though it is rarely relevant," Thesivan said, "in cases of formal liaison petition. If the human can demonstrate that the petition is motivated by genuine personal attachment rather than political convenience, the protections are extended in perpetuity rather than for the standard term." "Do you wish to make that demonstration?" Marina looked at Astarion. He kept his expression neutral, which cost him something. How does a human demonstrate genuine personal attachment to a 700-year-old vampire prince before a tribunal? Marina asked. "In a way that you would find convincing?" One of the other tribunal members, a lean ancient named Corvith, made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. "Typically, the demonstration is evidentiary," Thesivan said. "Documents, testimony, evidence of existing relationship. But it has occasionally been verbal. The tribunal has some discretion." Marina opened her sketchbook to a page near the back and removed a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it and held it up. It was a drawing, done in graphite with the precision and layered intelligence she brought to everything, and it depicted Astarion in the moment he had entered her studio, the moment before he had reached Valores, when he had just come through the door. She had drawn him in the split second of arrival, weight forward, every line of his body oriented toward where she stood. and what she had captured was not the danger of the moment, but the care underneath it. The particular quality of someone who had crossed whatever distance was required to place themselves between a threat and the thing they could not afford to lose. She had drawn it. Astarion realized with something that cracked quietly along a fault line he had not known existed in him, from the perspective of the person being moved toward. She had drawn what it had looked like from her side. She had seen him. "I drew this from memory this morning," Marina said. "I have not slept. I was thinking about what remains." She looked at the tribunal, and then at him. What remains is someone who spent 40 years protecting a world he was the last one left to protect, and who stood outside my window for 6 weeks because he found something he did not know he was still capable of wanting. She paused. "I did not know I was capable of wanting it either, until I painted it before I knew what I was painting." Thesivane regarded her for a long moment. "Perpetuity," the tribunal head said finally, and brought her hand down on the table with the formal sound that closed a court matter. The protections were extended in perpetuity. Veloris left the tribunal chamber without speaking. Astarion walked Marina out through the vault stone corridor and up the concealed staircase that emerged in the basement of the bookshop that served as street-level access to the court, a detail Marina noted with what appeared to be genuine delight. "A bookshop," she said. "Of course. The original proprietor was a Moroi court liaison," Astarion said. "The current owner is his great-great-granddaughter. She has maintained the shop and the Akkas axe point for 160 years. Marina looked around at the towering shelves of old books with the expression she wore when something pleased her practically as well as aesthetically. "I like her already." They emerged onto the pavement outside in the small hours of the morning. The street quiet and damp from earlier rain, the city doing the thing it did at that hour when it was neither entirely asleep nor entirely awake. "Veloris will appear before the court tomorrow," Astarion said, "to confess the coercion. It will formally close the last of the faction's influence, and the blood decree will pass within the month. Without the faction's opposition, the tribunal has already signaled its support." Marina nodded. She had her sketchbook tucked under her arm and her hands in the pockets of her coat. She looked up at him in the particular way she had, of looking at things she intended to understand fully. "Are you going to stand outside my window anymore?" she asked. "No," he said. "Good. I intend to be inside it." The smile that crossed Marina's face was brief and entirely genuine, the kind that reached her eyes. "Then come up," she said. "I am going to paint you properly, and I want you to tell me about the 1st century. I think it was probably interesting." He followed her back toward the studio, through the quiet, wet streets, and there was something in the quality of the air around him that was different from how the air had felt for a very long time. Not lighter, exactly. Just more inhabited, more real. The weeks that followed were not without difficulty. Veloris did appear before the tribunal and make his formal confession, as Astarion had required. But the public nature of his humiliation meant that a small cluster of the faction's remaining loyalists made a last, poorly conceived attempt at relevance. They targeted not Marina this time, because the tribunal's perpetuity ruling had made her untouchable within the blood laws, but they targeted the bookshop and the liaison records it housed, attempting a theft that would have compromised a century and a half of compact documentation. They failed, because Astarion had anticipated exactly this, and had stationed 3 of his most trusted court guardians in the vicinity, old loyal vampires with long memories and longer patience. The faction's loyalists were taken before they reached the shop's basement access and brought before the tribunal within the hour. Marina heard about it the following evening from Astarion himself, who had developed the habit of appearing at her studio window rather than her door, a vampire habit she had noted, teased him about, and privately found she appreciated because it always arrived at the moment she had been working long enough to need a reason to stop. "You anticipated that," she said. "Yes. You did not tell me you anticipated it. I did not want you to worry about something I had already managed." Marina looked at him with an expression that occupied the space between affection and exasperation with the particular grace of someone for whom both feelings were genuine. "You protected me from worrying. Is that a fault?" "It is a tendency I am going to gently push back on," she said. "I can handle information, Astarion. I am not fragile." "I know you are not fragile," he said, and the way he said it had a weight that made the words carry more than their surface content. "I simply found myself reluctant to give you a reason to look concerned. I have found I prefer your face without concern on it." Marina went quiet in the way she did when something genuinely moved her, but she was processing it before she responded. "That," she said finally, "is the most romantic thing you have said so far, and you said it entirely by accident." He looked at her. "I am not certain it was entirely by accident." The studio had, in the weeks since Astarion had begun spending his evenings there, accumulated a quality that was different from its previous state. Not physically. Marina had not reorganized anything for his benefit, and he would not have wanted her to. But the air in the room had changed, the way air changed in spaces that had become genuinely inhabited by two people rather than one. There were two mugs by the kettle instead of one, habitually. The wooden chair he had appropriated on the first evening had been moved slightly closer to the workspace, not so close as to crowd, but close enough for easy conversation. She painted while he talked, or he watched while she worked in silence, or they debated things, art and history and the particular nature of beauty, and whether the old codes he lived by were still adequate to the modern world. She challenged him in those debates with the cheerful, merciless precision of someone who had thought carefully about every position she held and expected the same rigor from anyone worth arguing with. He pushed back with 7 centuries of perspective, and she pushed back against his 7 centuries with the pointed observation that length of experience was not the same as quality of insight. And he found, to his genuine surprise, that arguing with Marina Wren was one of the most enjoyable things he had done in recent memory. She painted him as she had promised. Not the oblique, layered painting she had done before she knew who he was, but a direct portrait, done over 3 evenings, in which she captured something he would not have been able to describe in words, but recognized immediately as accurate when he saw the finished work. She had painted him at rest, which was not a state most people observed in him, because rest implied safety, and he had not felt safe, genuinely safe, in the presence of another person for longer than he wanted to calculate. She had painted the specific quality of temporary stillness over deep perpetual motion that was the honest truth of how he existed in the world. "You made me look peaceful," he said, when she turned the finished canvas to show him. "You were peaceful for approximately 4 minutes while you were telling me about the library in the original court vault. You forgot to hold the political posture. I was not aware I held a political posture. You do. It is very impressive, but it slips occasionally." She looked at the painting and then at him. I like what is underneath it." He looked at the painting for a moment longer. "What is underneath it," he said, "has not been visible to anyone in a considerable amount of time. I know." She moved to stand beside him in front of the canvas. "I think that was the loneliest thing you told me. Not the loss of your family, not the 40 years of political warfare, the forgetting how to want things for yourself, the becoming entirely a function." He turned to look at her. She was close, in the way she had become comfortable being close to him over the past weeks, without the careful management of distance that most people maintained around him. Instinctively, the physical expression of the respect that bordered on fear that his presence tended to produce, Marina had never been afraid of him. He had identified this on the first evening, and found it, initially puzzling and then, as he understood her better, entirely consistent with who she was. She was not fearless in the general sense. She was not reckless or naive about danger. She simply made careful decisions about what she would allow to intimidate her, and she had decided, apparently from very early in their acquaintance, that he did not qualify. "It was the most disarming thing anyone had ever done to him, Marina," he said. "Yes. The formal compact does not require anything further than what was established at the tribunal. I know. What I feel for you is not a function of the compact." She looked up at him with those dark eyes that missed nothing. "I know that too. I want to be certain you know it," he said, "because the compact places a formal obligation on me that could be confused with something personal, and I want there to be no confusion. What I feel is personal. The compact is simply the structure that allows me to ensure your safety within the blood laws. It is not the reason." "What is the reason?" she asked quietly. He lifted his hand and touched her face, which he had not done before, and the warmth of her skin against his cool fingers was the most acutely human sensation he could remember experiencing in a very long time. "You saw what I was," he said, "before you knew who I was. And you painted it without diminishing it and without making it something other than what it is. You painted the darkness accurately, and you did not try to put light into it that was not there. You understood that what exists in the threshold is not deficient for being there." He paused. "You made me feel as though what I am is something worth being." Marina's eyes were bright. She raised her hand and placed it over his, the one that was still against her face, holding it there. "It is," she said. "What you are is something worth being, and what you are becoming, which is someone who lets himself want things again, that is worth being too." He bent his head and kissed her, slowly, with the careful deliberateness of someone who understood the specific gravity of a first thing, who had learned that first things should be given their full weight. She kissed him back with the same quality of attention she gave to everything she valued, complete and unhurried and entirely present. When they separated, she kept her hand over his, and they stood together in front of the portrait she had painted of him at peace, in the warm light of the work lamps that most closely approximated honest light, and the studio was entirely quiet around them. "I should tell you something," Marina said. "Tell me." "I showed Thesivane the sketch at the tribunal because it was the truest evidence I had. But I had been drawing you for longer than just that morning. I have a sketchbook, nearly full at this point." She looked at him sideways. "I had been trying to understand what I was feeling by painting around it." Astarion looked at her with an expression that was warm in a way that had taken him several decades to learn to allow himself. "Show me." She retrieved the sketchbook from the shelf where she kept it and brought it to him, and they sat together in the wooden chair that was really too narrow for two people, but managed it, and she turned the pages slowly. The sketches were of him, from the months of her oblique observation, from the evenings since, from the 3 weeks of the portrait sessions and the countless details she had captured in passing, a hand gesture during a particular story, the angle of his head when he was listening, the quality of his expression. At the moment he forgot to maintain the political posture. He looked through them in silence, page by page, and what he felt as he looked was something that had no clean name in any language he had spoken across 7 centuries. But that was related to the feeling of coming back to a place you had believed lost and finding it intact, and understanding that the absence had been temporary rather than permanent. The court had been restored. The blood laws were strengthened. The faction that had destroyed his family had been fully dismantled, and the last of its members had been brought before the tribunal and formally removed from the compact. The Moroi line would not continue. In the traditional sense of the bloodline, he was the last, and vampire succession was differently than human dynastic succession, but the court itself would endure, and the laws that protected the intersection of 2 worlds would endure with it. He had done what Vien had asked him to do. He had remained, he had held, and a painter in a 3rd-floor studio had turned toward him with a sketchbook full of evidence and said that what remained was worth something. There was a night, 2 months into this altered life, when Marina asked him about the future in a way that was not indirect. They were on the roof of her building, which they had taken to occupying on clear nights, because Marina found it useful to look at large amounts of sky while she was developing new work, and because Astarion had not sat on a rooftop purely for the pleasure of it in longer than he could remember. She had a blanket and he had no need of one, and they sat with the city spread out below them and the sky above them doing the things that skies did over cities at 2 in the morning. I am not going to ask you to do anything to me that I have not thought carefully about, Marina said. I want you to know that I understand the implications of our situation in terms of time. Astarion did not say anything immediately. I am 26, she said. You are 732. In 40 years I will be 66, and you will be 772. In 60 years, if I am fortunate, I will be 86 and probably annoying about it. And you will be exactly the same as you are right now. I have considered this, he said. I know you have. You have probably considered it exhaustively and from every angle, because that is how you consider things. She turned to look at him. I am not asking you to solve it. I am telling you that I am aware of it, and I am telling you that I am choosing this anyway, knowingly and deliberately. Whatever we have, for whatever time we have it, I want it. Marina, he said. The Vampire Compact does have provisions, she said carefully. I have researched them. There is a blood compact mechanism for transformation under specific conditions with tribunal approval. I am not asking for that now. I am saying I know it exists, and I know there will be a conversation at some point, and I am not afraid of having it. Astarion was quiet for a moment. The city hummed below them. The Transformation Compact requires the human to be the formal petition holder, he said. The vampire cannot initiate it. The decision must originate entirely from the human, because the blood laws are designed to ensure that transformation is never coerced. That is a good law. It is one of the laws I am most proud of maintaining. Then I will know where to file the petition, Marina said. When I am ready to file it. She looked up at the sky, which may be sooner rather than later. I find I am deeply impatient with the idea of running out of time before I have painted everything I need to paint. Astarion looked at her profile against the city light, the particular clarity of it, the intelligence and warmth and stubborn, precise beauty of her, and felt the thing that had been cracked open in him on the first evening she had turned the canvas around, expand quietly into something that occupied far more space than he had believed he still had available. "Whatever you decide," he said. "I will be here," Marina said. "That is the part I was least certain about. A few months ago, now I am entirely certain." She leaned against him, which she had learned she could do, and he had learned to accept with the specific pleasure of someone discovering a warmth they had forgotten was possible. "You are the most reliably present person I have ever known, and you have been alive for 7 centuries, and were standing outside my window for 6 weeks before you came in, which is either a contradiction or a very Astarion thing." "It is a very Astarion thing," he said, and the tone of it made her laugh. And the sound of her laughing was one he had quietly begun to catalogue alongside all the other details of Marina Wren that had accumulated in him like a second archive. He held her on the roof, under the sky, in the city that contained both the ancient vault of the Moroi court and a 3rd-floor studio with work lamps that produced honest light. Below them the world moved through its ordinary human rhythms, unaware of the compact that kept it safe, unaware of the old codes and the blood laws and the political machinery that ran in the dark beneath the surface, unaware of the last prince of a restored dynasty sitting on a rooftop with a painter who had looked at what he was and found it sufficient. He thought about what remained. His mother had asked him to hold, and he had held. He had spent 40 years as a function, a mechanism of survival and restoration, and he had succeeded at the function fully and completely. The court endured, the laws endured, the compact endured, and then Marina Wren had hung a painting of the threshold between darkness and light in a gallery, and something in him that had been managing without light for a very long time had turned toward it with the involuntary precision of a plant finding a window. What remained, after the loss and the war and the 40 years of solitary endurance, was this: a woman on a rooftop with a sketchbook full of the things she had seen in him before she had permission to, a compact made before a tribunal that Thesivane had ended with the word perpetuity, which meant forever, which was a word Marina Wren was going to have increasing access to as time went on. What remained was the ability to want things which he had believed gone and which had turned out to be waiting, patient and intact for something worth wanting. The petition for Marina's transformation was filed 11 months later, on a winter evening, when the city was wrapped in the particular cold that came in off the water and made the streets glitter. Marina filed it herself, sitting at the tribunal table with Astarion at her right side, and she had prepared for it with the same thorough attention she brought to every serious undertaking, reading the full compact documentation, annotating the blood law sections she had questions about, presenting to the tribunal a statement of intention that Thesivane later described as the most rigorously considered she had received in a century. Corvith had actually smiled. The tribunal approved it within the hour. Perpetuity, Thesivane had said the first time, and perpetuity was consistent with itself. The transformation was not a dramatic or violent thing. The blood laws had evolved the process over centuries specifically to remove the coercive elements that had characterized the old unregulated practice. It was formal, consensual, documented, and witnessed by the tribunal. It was conducted in the old vault. In the lamplight that behaved almost but not quite like fire, Marina had brought her sketchbook. She told Astarion afterward, been sketching the vault's lamp behavior for months, and had only just worked out how to render it accurately. She wanted to do it whilst she still had the full technical experience of human vision to draw from, because she was curious about whether her perception of it would change once she was seeing with the extended spectrum that came with transformation. She wanted to compare. He loved her with an intensity that had no edges and no ceiling. The months that followed the transformation were not without their adjustments. Marina's artistic practice shifted, not in fundamental approach or quality, but in the specific technical possibilities available to her. She could work in lower light, could hold a finer detail for longer, could see a wider range of color in the spectrum. She described the adjustments to him with the same analytical pleasure she brought to any technical evolution in her work, as problems that were interesting rather than difficulties that were burdens. She also, in the way of newly made vampires, required a period of learning the blood compact's protocols for her new status, a process she approached with characteristic thoroughness. She attended court sessions with Astarion and asked questions that occasionally surprised the ancient members of the tribunal with their precision. She established a formal relationship with Thesevain that had, from both sides, the quality of mutual respect between people who recognized each other as serious. She painted the vault. She painted the court. She painted Thesevain's face, which the ancient tribunal head examined for a long time with an expression that was difficult to read, and then asked if she could keep. She painted Astarion on the night of their first anniversary together, in the studio that was still her studio, in the honest light of the work lamps. She painted him the way she always painted the things she understood most completely, in layers, each one true on its own terms, and truer in combination, the grief and the pride and the patience and the warmth that had been waiting under the political posture for longer than most human civilizations had existed, and the specific quality of someone who had come back from believing themselves the last of something, and found that what remained was more than enough. She titled it What Remains. It hung in the Moroi court vault, opposite the stone table where the tribunal sat, so that every proceeding conducted there occurred in sight of it. Thesevain had insisted. The painting, the old vampire had said in her cave-resonant voice, was a historical document as much as an artistic one, and historical documents belonging to the court were kept by the court. Astarion had looked at it on the night it was hung, and felt, as he always did looking at Marina's work, the complete and wordless accuracy of being fully seen. She came to stand beside him, as she had the first evening in the studio, her shoulder against his arm, her sketchbook under her arm, as always. She looked at the painting with the critical eye of an artist examining her own work for what it had failed to capture versus what it had managed. "I think the left side is slightly overworked," she said. "The left side is perfect," he said. "You are not an objective evaluator. I have had 700 years of practice evaluating art, and approximately 1 year of practice being the subject of it, which compromises your objectivity in this instance entirely." He turned to look at her. Her dark hair was down, the way she still often wore it, and her eyes were the same dark, direct, entirely seeing eyes that had looked at him across a paint-stained studio on the night everything had changed, though now they carried the additional quality of light that came with transformation, a deepening rather than an alteration. "Marina," he said. "Yes." He took her hand, which he did easily now, with the ease of long practice and certain belonging. "You told me on the first evening that you would be responsible for reminding me what remains. I remember you have done so." He looked at the painting and then at her. "Every day, without making a project of it, you have done exactly that." Marina looked up at him with a smile that was small and genuine, the kind that reached everywhere. "You make it easy," she said. "You are very good at being reminded, once you allow yourself to be. I was not before. You were before. You just needed someone to arrive with the right evidence." She squeezed his hand. "You bought the painting because you recognized it. That is the beginning of a man who already knows how to be reminded. I just confirmed what the painting started." He looked at her. This woman he had watched from a pavement for 6 weeks and argued with about artistic theory and historical accuracy, who had stood with a blade at her throat and told him she was fine, so that he would know she had not broken, who had filed a petition before an ancient tribunal with annotations in the margins, and changed his understanding of what forever could contain. He said, "I love you." Marina went still in the particular way she did when something landed with its full weight. Then she said, "I have loved you since I painted you, before I knew who you were. And I knew what that was before I was willing to say it, which is very unlike me, but some things are large enough to require time before they become words." What made it become words now? She looked at the painting on the vault wall. "You said it first, which is also very unlike you, and I find I am not willing to let you be braver than about something this important." He laughed, which was a sound that the old stone vault had probably not heard in some considerable time, and Marina laughed with him, and the lamps with their not quite ordinary fire moved as if responding to something. Thesivane, passing the doorway on her way to the record chamber, paused, looked in, and made no comment. But she was smiling as she walked on, with the expression of someone who had lived long enough to recognize an outcome that the blood laws had been built for. The reason the compact existed in the first place, the reason ancient codes of honor and protection and mutual responsibility had been written and maintained across centuries, not because the powerful required protection from the world, because the powerful sometimes required someone who could make them remember that they were still within it. The city moved above the vault as it always did, millions of lives running in their ordinary courses, unaware of the chamber beneath the bookshop, unaware of the two figures standing together before a painting called "What Remains in the Light of Lamps," whose flames bent toward warmth. The court endured, the laws endured, the compact endured, and Astarion Moroi, last prince of the Moroi line, who had spent 40 years believing that what he had lost was the entirety of what he had been given to lose, stood in the vault his ancestors had carved from bedrock, and understood, with the complete and bone-deep certainty of someone who had waited long enough to know the difference between hoping and knowing that what remained was everything. Marina leaned into him, warm and certain and entirely present as she always was, and the darkness of the vault around them was not empty, was not only absence, but was the same quality of living darkness she had painted 700 years of his life into, the threshold that held its breath the moment before, the space where something ancient and irreversible was in the process of becoming something new, and it was, as it had been in her painting, exactly right.